10 minutes of Treyarch Zombies Lore Facts. Samantha and Eddie crossed over into the new universe sometime in the mid-1960s, but most likely in 1965, as that's when the Togder-Toten pocket dimension is set, which also tracks with the ages of both of them as they are in their early 30s during the events of Black Ops Cold War. The KGB's Omega Group was founded in August of 1975, which is 8 full years prior to the founding of their eventual adversary, Requiem. The Omega Group was established to identify, study, and weaponize types of psychotronic phenomena such as biocommunication, bioinformation, and bioenergetics. If you don't know, psychotronics is a term created by the Soviets in real life as a catch-all term for, well, the paranormal. Basically, strange things would occur. Someone would go, "Oh, well, that was kind of spooky," while the government sat there and was like, "How can I use this to spy on my enemies?" For instance, in the Omega Group formation memo, the term biocommunications can actually be broken down into the two other types of phenomena listed. Bioinformation refers to paranormal activity occurring between two living organisms, such as telepathy or precognition, while bioenergetics refers to living beings having the ability to affect matter without physically interacting with it. Telekinesis is a prime example. All of this, as mentioned in the Omega formation memo, was first identified by the Soviets as having some actual tangible merit to it in 1924. Again, despite all this being lore in a video game, this is all stuff that is actually inspired by real-life research that was conducted by the Soviets, all hidden away behind the Iron Curtain. And while a lot of government officials chalked this up to a load of nonsense, later on, as the Cold War kicked off, they began taking an actual interest in all this stuff. And then, through the means of espionage, the Americans, more specifically the CIA, would find out about all of this and go, "Hey, if our adversaries are devoting resources to this stuff, we should try and see if there's any actual merit to it." And thus, operations such as Grill Flame and Gondola Wish would be undertaken, which all fall under the wider Project Stargate, which was the American version of the exact same things the Soviets were researching, such as ESP, telepathy, remote viewing, and even astral projection, with both sides trying to see if they could eventually weaponize what we would consider the supernatural. We're not even 2 whole lore facts into this video, and I've already gone on an entire side tangent about the East and West trying to weaponize the paranormal in the real world. So, to make a long story short, the real adversarial threat to the Omega Group, going off their original mission statement, would actually have been the CIA's Project Stargate. By the way, if you're interested in reading about all this, we've linked a specific unclassified CIA document which served as the direct inspiration for this particular aspect of the story. Oh, yeah. Did I mention that to bolster their scientific efforts, Omega Group was comprised of hand-picked specialists from Spetsgruppe Alpha, Spetsgruppe Wimpel, and Spetsgruppe Smerch to add in domestic and foreign operations. In other words, this paranormal research group was backed by the Spetsnaz. The first recorded breach of the Dark Ether in modern human history occurred on the 7th of March, 1944, precisely 10:03 p.m. at the Project N Station facility in Morasko, Poland. Project N Station started off as a nuclear research facility established by the Uranverein to make advances in uranium enrichment and drastic progress within the Reich's atomic program, in hopes of developing the first nuclear bomb. And for the first nearly 8 months of Project N Station, that's exactly what they were focused on, and great advancements they did indeed make, as located within the defunct N Station facility. You can find a non-functioning atomic weapon that appears to have been nearing the final stages of its development. All progress would have been halted on this device at some point within the following months after the breach occurred, as N Station would set its sights on an entirely new field of study, a realm, they believed, that if the powers were harnessed correctly, could turn the entire course of the war. And while the Axis powers would ultimately lose World War II, that initial breaching between our two worlds on that day in 1944 would prove to have far-reaching consequences as the decades went on. The power that those within N Station, and later Requiem, Omega, and other forces would seek to take advantage of was originally dubbed Exo-Element 1 by N Station themselves, though the proper name for it would be Etherium, a substance that is plentiful in nature in the Dark Ether. We mostly see it in crystalline form, in its solid state, but on rare occasions we also see it in the form of a gas, or even in a liquid state. Whenever you think of gods in terms of a zombie storyline, you probably think of the gods in the Chaos story, or Monthan the Shadow Man. What you might not know is that in the Ether storyline there's actually a being that is more powerful than both of them. I'm referring to the first one, a very seldom mentioned deity brought up in Black Ops 3 Zombies, that is, as their name suggests, the ultimate god of the Ether. They created the multiverse, the summoning key, and the keepers themselves. It is also extremely likely that they also created Agartha. As I mentioned, however, they are very seldom mentioned. In fact, it's almost as if they just up and completely disappeared from existence altogether, sometime after setting up everything I just mentioned. The fact, paired with in-game evidence such as Monty's worm quote, led to a theory in the community that the first one actually split into two separate entities, that being Dr. Monty and the Shadow Man. Speaking of the Keepers, if you've read the timeline or paid attention to BO3 and 4 Zombies, you know that the Keepers existed prior to the Apothicons, as the latter only came about after losing the War of Agartha and being subjected to Dark Ether corruption for eons. What you probably don't know is that the Apothicon language predates their existence. We know this because it's present on the Chronorium and the Summoning Key, the Summoning Key being the oldest creation in all of the Ether. This means that the Apothicon language is actually the original language spoken by the Keepers, and that after they were banished, the Apothicons retained their language while the Keepers created a new one entirely. This is particularly interesting given that, somewhat overall, the Keepers represent order and stasis in the story, while the Apothicons represent absolute chaos. The fact that even after changing so much, they chose to retain this one piece of their former selves is fascinating. To take this language thing a step further, the Keeper language that's presented to us is strikingly similar to Sumerian cuneiform, the first human language ever, implying that the Keepers gave humanity written language. This is neat because it plays into the whole ancient astronaut and conspiracy vibe that Zombies is known for. Oscar Strauss, known for his time with Project Endstation and later Requiem, also worked on another infamous German project iconic to the Black Ops series, that being Giftiger Sturm, aka Toxic Storm in English, also known as the project that Nova 6 and its various counterparts were developed under, led by Black Ops 1 side villain Friedrich Steiner. Strauss eventually escaped Germany and fled to the United States towards the end of the war via Operation Paperclip, a U.S. operation which saw the co-opting of many German scientists, mainly those whose expertise lied in rocket and aviation research, or on biological and chemical testing. One notable example being Werner von Braun, who worked on the V-2 rocket for the Reichstag, and then later, after being co-opted by Paperclip, would become a higher-up in NASA and contribute heavily to the Apollo missions. Historical tangent aside, did you know that in Ether there was an almost identical operation proposed by Ultimus Richthofen and carried out by the Americans called Operation Stapler? This was essentially the same thing as Paperclip, although specifically for 935 scientists and research. Basically, in August of 1945, knowing that they were in the waning days for the group, and knowing that he could leverage the group's assets to get what he wanted, he struck a deal. Unfettered access to Group 935's research in exchange for the safe harbor of a great many of their scientists and their families. Unbeknownst to the Americans at the time, Richthofen also struck the same deal with the Soviets. He played both sides, and in exchange for all these assets, he prepared two separate lists of demands for the global giants, which they met. Some notable demands being from the Russians, a spacesuit and lunar lander, coordinates to be specified, and from the Americans, a polarization tower to be constructed at what would later become the Hanford site. Here's a fun one. Did you know that the Ether and Agartha are actually the same thing? The only difference between them is that the Ether is four-dimensional, non-corporeal, and impossible to perceive under normal circumstances. Agartha is the opposite. It's basically just the Ether translated into a 3D space. It exists and is constructed of the Ether. The Zombies map Revelations actually takes place in Agartha. Janice Richthofen, Eddie, Dimension 2210 Richthofen, the director, whatever you want to call him, has been around in the Zombies storyline since Origins, the map released in August of 2013. It's been 11 years since this iteration of Richthofen was introduced. Isn't that crazy? With there being so many different variations of characters throughout the Zombies storyline, you might be surprised to learn that there's only ever been one version of Samantha Maxis throughout the entire history of the mode. Even that weird American Origins Sam. That's actually still the same Sam from World at War up to that point, despite the weird accent change. Unlike Samantha though, did you know that there are technically two different Avogadros? The Avogadro from Transit is actually a weaker version of the Avogadro which was created by Broken Arrow by experimenting on a sample taken from Cornelius Purnell by Rustman and Barkley in 2025, Purnell being the stronger actual version of the Avogadro, seen in Alpha Omega. Primus Richthofen has the highest kill count out of any version of the character. Despite this version of Richthofen trying so desperately to set things right in his own way, he actually causes the most damage out of any of the Richthofens. By stealing the summoning key at the end of Shadows of Evil, he prevents the Keepers from saving Dimension 63, which in turn gets destroyed by the Apothicons. This not only means he's responsible for the death of the entire Earth in that dimension, but also all other life throughout its cosmos. And due to the cycle, this just keeps happening on repeat, meaning he just canonically has like a 10 quadrillion kill count. We all know that the Earth explodes at the end of Moon's Easter egg, but what you might not know is the locations the rockets actually hit. The first can be seen in Nuketown Zombies during the Game Over screen. The second can be found in transit over at the town location. You can see bits and pieces of the rocket in the bank and the bowling alley just outside the map. The third location is unknown, unfortunately. but fans have long speculated that it hit either near Buried or Die Rise's location. Earlier in the video, we talked about the closest thing to God in the Aether story, that being the first one. On the flip side of that, in the Dark Aether story, the closest comparison is an ancient megalith, sentient rock known as the Construct. Nobody knows how it got there, or what it is, but it's been there since the dawn of the Dark Aether, silently but ever-presently watching life over the course of countless millennia.